Professor Boer, you've been living and teaching in China for over 10 years now. You have also published a few books to explain Chinese socialism with themes ranging from socialist modernization, economy, governance, and democracy. So could you start out by telling us what's the most impressive discovery about Chinese-style democracy that you have made through your research?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, perhaps I could just say a little bit more about my experience and also the research project that I've been involved in. The books that you mentioned are a result of a 10-year project focusing on Chinese socialism, on the history and theory of socialist governance. And I found that in my research, more than 90% of the material was Chinese language scholarly material. There is a lot of quality material in China on this, so it's many, many hours of reading and research during the project. But in terms of your question, in my opinion, and there's many, many things that impress me, the most impressive discovery of Chinese-style democracy is the way in which democratic centralism has successfully become the way for governing the country. Now, let me explain a little more on this. The concept and practice of democratic centralism initially arose 120 years ago in Russia, and through trial and error it became the way in which the Communist Party of the Soviet Union governed itself internally. However, it was simply assumed that you could extend democratic centralism from the party to governing the country. And what they really didn't analyse properly was the huge step to doing so, what was needed to do it. And it would take many, many years to find a solution to this problem of practice and reflection on the practice. Now, to my mind, China has actually solved this problem. Now, how? Here we need to get a bit technical, but they're very important technical terms. I'm just going to mention two. The first one is statutory procedures, and the second one is governing the country according to the rule of law. Now, summing up what potentially could be a very long discussion, we can say that for the will of the CPC to become the will of the people, it must go through a comprehensive democratic process. It arises from that process and then goes through that process, through the many levels of people's congresses, political consultative conferences, gaining on the way significant feedback, debate and proposals. And only then can a proposal be adopted. Mm-hmm. That's the process by which democratic centralism has become a mode of governing the whole country. And that's the most impressive step to my mind, because it's never actually been done before in history, let alone in a socialist country in that way. As a footnote, I should also say that I'm deeply impressed, and I continue my study by the way China has established and is developing further a socialist rule of law and a socialist legal system. It's completely unlike Western approaches.
Yes,
this is actually really significant achievement. It also, as we know, draws on the best of China's legal tradition. But this socialist rule of law is a pioneering achievement. And I think it will become a model for other countries to consider their own context, their own traditions in developing a viable rule of law legal system for themselves. Sorry, you wanted to say something.
No, it's okay. Could you elaborate more about the socialist rule of law? How is it different from like what we normally understand the rule of law?
Yeah, I think if you look at the Western systems, which arose in Western Europe, and I should say don't transplant very well elsewhere, they have this notion of the theoretical separation of powers, where the legal system is entirely separate from the political system and so on and so forth. And the basic distinction that they operate with is between public and private law. This is how it's developed. Mm-hmm. Now, we already found earlier in the Soviet Union that they were not going to follow a public and private distinction. in the law system because this was in a capitalist context. And it's not going to work in a country that's building socialism. So they started to develop different departments of law that dealt with different areas, whether it was economic law, social law, etc., civil law. This has been developed much, much further in a Chinese context. But I should also say that what makes it a socialist rule of law and a socialist legal system, we'll come back to this later, is that it embodies the leadership of the CPC within the socialist rule of law. And it is through the rule of law that the leadership is strengthened, and through the CPC's leadership that the law is strengthened. Now, that is something that is quite distinct and has taken a lot of work because it's never actually been done before in that way.
Is there something brand new created in China's political system under the CPC's leadership?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And because it's never been done before, it has taken a lot of work, and it's an ongoing project. And it has been very notable. It goes right back, of course, but the last 10 years have seen significant development in that, really since the new era from 2012 and the 18th National Congress of the CPC. If you're doing something new, you're learning from all the past things, China's long tradition, examples from other countries, but you're actually doing something new. You have to go through trial and error, pilot projects, revising what you're doing. And that's happened. The basic system is there, and it's an ongoing process of developing further. It's quite astounding, actually.
Yeah. Well, unlike Western political systems that mainly focus on elections, a key feature of China's socialist democracy, or we call it whole process people's democracy, is that it combines electoral democracy and consultative democracy. So, in your opinion, how do the two forms of democracy complement and reinforce each other?
Well, since I'm a philosopher and I do engage in political philosophy, I'm going to answer with initially a philosophical point. The relationship between electoral democracy and consultative democracy is a dialectical relationship. It's a dialectical relationship. Okay, now let's explore what this means. We need to recognize a significant difference between Western and Chinese approaches. So in the West, there's this overwhelming tendency to see things in terms of either or, zero sum, it's also called. And so for a Western tradition, it becomes either this or that. Now, by contrast, the Chinese approach, and I think also in other places too, can be described as both and, or as the popular saying puts it, things that oppose each other also complement one another. How does this work with electoral and consultative democracy? Well, to begin with, we should note the institutionalization in the People's Congresses, the many levels, and the People's Political Consultative Conferences. The highest levels of meet, of course, at the 2 sessions, and we've just had this year's 2 sessions. Now, the People's Congresses work primarily through electoral procedures, all the way from electing delegates, direct elections at the lower levels, indirect at the higher levels, and to voting on pieces of legislation. And of course, the National People's Congress is the highest legislative body in the country. The People's Political Consultative Conferences embody, as the name suggests, primarily a consultative approach in which all political parties, mass organisations, minority nationalities, etc., engage in substantial and in-depth consultation on all matters. But the problem is putting it this way, People's Congresses, political consultative conferences, electoral and consultative, it separates them too far. Because from what we find is that the electoral process itself benefits from consultative dimensions to it. And, elections that take place in light of consultation become more robust and stronger elections. So the two work together, but you have to have a cultural tradition where this is seen to be possible for it to work. Anyway, I could say much more, but that's enough. I would add here that I've also undertaken significant research into base level or grassroots democratic practices. And this, these are as old as the CPC itself, but it has risen to a new level in the last 10 to 15 years, and throughout the country, heaps and heaps of research on this. In the mountains, in villages, in city communities, grassroots democracy is increasingly practiced in relation to budgets, local project, democratic supervision, and so on. It really is, another dimension of the way in which the socialist democratic system is being strengthened, being enhanced right throughout.
Well, speaking of China's socialist democracy, we know another key feature or an important weight of China's democratic practices is the process from the people to the people. And all major lawmaking decisions in China, as you also mentioned, are the result of a democratic process. So could you give us some examples of the involvement of people in the development of legislation in China?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's also, of course, known as from the masses to the masses, from the people to the people. And the mass line, goes back to the earliest days of the CPC. But in terms of legislation, I have been following rather closely the development in the last decade or so of specific consultative processes for developing legislation, at a number of levels, national, provincial, city levels, but a main focus on grassroots contact points for developing these. And here we find hearings, proposals, panels, feasibility studies, and much more, so as to nurture proposals from the ground up. But the example I'd like to give, and again, I've studied it closely, and it's actually, if I may say, one of the chapters in my recently published book concerns the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region National Security Law, which was promulgated in June of 2020 and came into effect at the beginning of 2021. Very, very good law. What impressed me most about this law, or this piece of legislation, was the patience and thoroughness of the procedure precisely while the Hong Kong storm was raging. Hundreds and hundreds of meetings and proposals, millions of characters written in developing it, suggestions and proposals from all quarters. The initial draft was sent out for review, was revised, sent out again, and so on, until it was felt that it could be promulgated. Only when this process from the people to the people was completed could that be promulgated and implemented. And in the book I mentioned in that chapter, I described this as a rule of law solution to the problems. And it seems to me it attests, and it shouldn't have done, but it did surprise some observers due to the significant development and robustness of China's socialist rule of law and legal system.
In recent years, we have heard more and more voices in the Western world asking, has China discovered a better political system than liberal democracy? I'd like to hear your analysis on this topic. Is China's socialist democracy superior to other democratic systems? Why or why not?
Okay, yeah. Well, look, my short answer is yes. China's socialist democracy is superior to anything we've seen before. Now, this is actually a qualitative assessment as to what constitutes genuine democracy. That's actually a step higher than the tendency to say, well, each country, each culture, each tradition should develop its own political system that best suits its circumstances. Now, this is, of course, very true. And one model can't be imposed on other places where it would be a poor fit indeed. And unfortunately, this has been attempted by Western liberal democracy with quite unimpressive results where it's been imposed, poor fit. But it's another matter to assess the quality of different systems. Perhaps we need to go back to the ancient Greek root of the term democracy, demokratia, which means rule by the people. And notably, the Chinese term minju is a very good translation of demokratia. It is the rule of the people, or other terms can be used, such as people-centred or taking the people as the centre. Now the question about the quality or the genuineness of democracy becomes straightforward. Only when the people are genuinely at the centre, are genuinely involved at all levels of democratic consultation, decision-making, developing legislation, supervision, and so on, can we speak of a genuine democracy. And to my mind, Chinese socialist democracy meets all of these criteria.
We talk about this, like when I spoke to a scholar from Canada, you may know her as well, Professor Radhika Desai. She told me self-criticism and self-reform in a constant process are major features of the Communist Party of China when it comes to governing the country and implementing its socialist democracy. How do you understand the CPC's self-criticism and self-reform compared to the Western political systems and political parties?
Well, actually, let me begin. I haven't said that much about Western political systems and political parties. I prefer not to spend too much time focusing on them, but we can say that they've actually been in a process of stagnation, decline, and fragmentation, at least for the last 50 years. Now, we need to ask why that's been happening. To begin with, the economic base has been in decline. The last boom of Western capitalist countries was in the 1950s and 60s. And from the time of the economic crisis of the 1970s, their growth began to decline. And by 2008, 2009, they hit rock bottom. And they've not recovered and are facing significant problems today, as we can all see. Now, since the political system relies on the economic base, it should be no surprise that this Western system has been in decline and is now fragmented and facing significant upheaval. In other words, they have not been able to self-reform and self-renew in the last 50 years. By contrast, the CPC and indeed China's political system as a whole has developed extremely robust forms of criticism and self-criticism. If problems arise, they're addressed in a timely manner. And a crucial factor, of course, here is the role of democratic supervision at so many levels that takes place. Let me put it this way, though. I've always been impressed by the emphasis on constant improvement in China. So no matter how good something is, no matter how much work has gone into developing the current situation in the present, it's never really assumed to have arrived, if I can put it that way. There's always a sense that it can be improved, that more work needs to be done. And of course, the times move on, and you do need to do that sort of thing. But it is that emphasis that the job is not finished, always can be improved further. And there are many, many examples of this, but it's very true of the CPC and China's political system.
This Japanese-American scholar, Fukuyama, he talked about the crisis, why we see like nowadays there's a decline in liberal democracy or in Western democracy. He said it was because of the influence of China and Russia. What's your take on that?
Oh, they love to blame someone else, don't they? They love to blame someone else because they can't face up to the fact that they need to focus on internal criticism and self-criticism and ask what are the internal reasons for the decline. So this is a standard approach you find. I should add, however, that Fukuyama, he was actually the one, back in the early 90s, who proclaimed the end of history.
Yes.
By which he meant that, the Western political system and the Western capitalist system was the final stage of human development, the highest achievement of human civilization. The problem is, once you do that, you stop reforming and improving. You think you've made it. But already underneath, the economic base is in decline. But all of this triumphalism concealed what was going on in the process. I might add here too, you can ask whether people, common people in Western countries, know at some level that there's a decline. Now, there's many examples of this, but I think a very good example is the way, for example, in Western Europe, more and more people are wishing that they could recover their imperial days from, you know, the 18th, 19th centuries and so on. Or the famous slogan, make the country great again, means you recognise that it's not great anymore, that its best days are in the past. The golden age is past. So there is a kind of internal awareness, but the thing they always try and do is try and blame someone else. And if they're going to keep doing that, they're not going to examine the problems they have in order to try and fix them.
That's a very good point. Lastly, Professor Boer, on how China's political system works, you once said, for Westerners who really want to know how it works, they have to understand one point, which is the leadership of the CPC is enhanced through democratic practice, and socialist democracy is strengthened through CPC leadership. Could you please elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, this is indeed the key. You know, I've also mentioned it in relationship to socialist rule of law and so on. And let me return to that philosophical point I made before. In this case, socialist democracy and the leadership of the CPC is a dialectical relationship. There's two terms here that interact with one another. They're not the same. One doesn't dominate the other one, but they have to interact with one another in a productive way. This is very, very difficult for Westerners to understand. The reason, many reasons for this long cultural history, influence of, you know, philosophy and so on in the West, as I mentioned, is to see things in terms of either or zero sum. So in this case, it's either the leadership of a political party or democratic practice. And what they don't realise is that it really is an interaction of the two. But for Westerners to understand how China's socialist democracy works, they're going to have to understand this point. They're going to have to put aside their Western assumptions, not an easy thing to do, and learn again. Or as I like to put it, have big ears and a small mouth. Listen, try to understand. Now, the interaction has many different forms, and the way that they interact with one another to strengthen one another. I've spoken earlier of democratic centralism, statutory procedures, governing the country according to the rule of law. But I would like to add a historical point here, that more than a century of the history of socialist countries has shown very clearly that socialist democracy works only with the leadership of the Communist Party, and the party's leadership works only with socialist democracy. Even more, it's been found out through historical experience that they strengthen one another in the process. If I may say so, this history of more than 100 years of the history and theory of socialist governance was actually the focus of my recent book. It was just published, I think, last month or something. So, yes, it's an absolutely crucial point, and Westerners are going to just have to understand it.